Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Je vais commencer. Je sais qu'il y a d'autres collègues qui vont arriver, mais je vais faire une petite introduction en français d'une séance qui aura lieu donc en anglais. C'est une séance un petit peu particulière. On est très heureux de recevoir Doug Fullington et Phil Chan pour cette séance du séminaire Chorégraphies dans le programme. Donc chorégraphie, écriture et dessin, signe et image dans les processus de création et de transmission chorégraphique, qui comporte donc plusieurs événements qui se poursuivent depuis 2018 avec ce séminaire qui, cette année, et que j'ai le plaisir de coordonner avec Lou Forster. Nous avons travaillé pour la programmation de cette année à des invitations principalement à des chorégraphes et des artistes contemporains dans l'idée de donner la parole, ce que nous avions trop peu fait dans les séances de séminaire précédentes, donner la parole à des artistes contemporains. Et ici, avec un cas un petit peu particulier, justement, entre la question du répertoire et du contemporain. Comment penser, par exemple, un ballet historique comme la Bayadère au prisme de notre monde contemporain ou de la création contemporaine? Nous avions eu le plaisir de recevoir Phil Chan en juin dernier, aux côtés de Meredith Martin et de Juliette Bello, pour discuter du projet Le Ballet des Porcelaines, une création à partir d'un livret de ballet oublié et d'une partition musicale du XVIIIe siècle, double support à l'invention. J'avais alors en introduction évoqué la question de l'anachronisme comme outil pour l'histoire. Alors je ne vais pas reprendre ce que j'ai dit la dernière fois, à savoir peut-on revendiquer l'anachronisme comme méthode scientifique, mais je voudrais insister sur quelques points pour introduire et donner un petit peu de contexte à cette séance. Insister sur notamment la question des formes du temps. Forme du temps, comment apprécier un objet historique et ses réinterprétations, cerner son ancrage dans un temps donné et sa circulation. Et surtout, peut-on penser l'authenticité d'une œuvre dans sa durée et son évolution? Je pense qu'il sera question à plusieurs reprises d'authenticité. C'est aussi comment faire vivre un héritage aujourd'hui en prenant compte des enjeux sociaux contemporains. Le cas de la Bayadère est exemplaire et je laisserai nos invités en parler directement. C'est un ballet qui pose clairement problème en termes éthiques, mais qu'on ne peut pas simplement rayer des répertoires. Que conserver alors? Les enjeux de la séance d'aujourd'hui sont à la fois de l'ordre éthique, historique, artistique, et une manière, je disais, de concevoir les formes du temps, expression tirée de l'ouvrage de Georges Kubler. Et Georges Kubler a cette distinction qu'il fait entre l'historien et l'antiquaire. Et je me permets de le citer ici. Je cite: « La contribution particulière de l'historien est la découverte des multiples formes du temps. L'objectif de l'historien, quelle que soit sa spécialité, est de dépeindre le temps. Il se consacre à la détection, à la description de la forme du temps. Il transpose, réduit, compose, colore un fac-similé comme un peintre qui, dans sa recherche de l'identité du sujet, doit découvrir un ensemble de propriétés qui susciteront la reconnaissance tout en transmettant une nouvelle perception du sujet. Il diffère de l'antiquaire ou du chercheur curieux, de la même manière que le compositeur de musique nouvelle diffère du concertiste. L'historien compose un sens à partir d'une tradition, tandis que l'antiquaire se contente de créer, d'interpréter ou de rejouer une partie obscure du temps passé sous des formes déjà familières. » Et cette dichotomie de Georges Kubler me semble poser problème, mais très bien poser aussi une distinction qui va être très largement nuancée aujourd'hui, à savoir entre l'historien et l'antiquaire. Et c'est, il me semble, une manière d'aborder aussi la démarche historienne et sa relation au processus de création. Une séance qui va aborder également la notation de manière un petit peu singulière par rapport à ce qu'on a fait jusqu'ici. Nous avions déjà abordé brièvement la notation Stepanov avec Claudia Jeschke lors d'une journée d'études organisée ici avec Bruno Ligor. Et je suis très heureuse que nous revenions plus en détail sur ce que peut apporter la notation Stepanov au travail de réinvention ou de reconstruction du ballet. Ce qui me permet donc de dire un dernier mot, ou insister, de choses que j'ai déjà évoquées. En invitant Phil Chan et Doug Fullington, nous avons aussi souhaité affirmer ici la place essentielle de l'association entre démarche historienne et processus de création. Quelque chose sur lequel on insiste et que je répète, je pense à chaque introduction de séance de séminaire ou de journée d'études, c'est que le programme Chorégraphies s'attache vraiment à la manière dont on peut relier des processus de création, une démarche historienne aussi de la part d'artistes chorégraphiques. Dans ce sens, les travaux de Doug Fullington nourrissent le programme de recherche depuis ses débuts et nous sommes donc très heureux et honorés de sa présence aujourd'hui. Doug Fullington est historien de la danse et musicologue, docteur en histoire de la musique de l'Université de Washington, avec une thèse sur les sources de 3 œuvres de Marius Petipa, la Bayadère, Raymondal, le jardin animé, divertissement issu du ballet Le Corsaire. Les travaux de Doug sur le ballet se concentrent sur les sources françaises et russes du XIXe siècle et il est l'une des rares personnes à lire couramment, je ne sais pas si on peut dire ça comme ça, lire couramment la notation chorégraphique, c'est pas neuf. Il a contribué à la reconstitution de plusieurs ballets historiques, notamment La fille du pharaon pour le Bolchoï en 2000, Le jardin animé donc du Corsaire pour la Pacific Northwest Ballet School, en 2004, Gisèle avec Marianne Smith et Peter Ball pour le Pacific Northwest Ballet, et Paquita avec Alexei Hartmansky et Marianne Smith en 2014. On lui doit de nombreux écrits sur la danse et il prépare actuellement un livre pour Oxford University Press avec sa collègue Marianne Smith sur les sources des ballets du 19e siècle, Five Ballets from Paris to St. Petersburg, Gisèle, Paquita, le Corsaire et la Bayadère Remonta. Et en 2016, il a été chercheur résident au Center for Ballet and the Arts de l'Université de New York et chercheur au Jacobs Pillow Dance Festival. Et il a passé 25 ans au Pacific Northwest Ballet Seattle, plus récemment en tant qu'assistant du directeur artistique Peter Ball et responsable des programmes de médiation. Non?
I'm just teasing.
Okay. You can still correct me afterwards. Phil Chan est cofondateur de Final Bow for Yellowface et auteur de Final Bow for Yellowface Dancing Between Intention and Impact, celui-ci. Et il vient de publier son second ouvrage Banishing Orientalism, Dancing Between Exotic and Familiar, celui-là. Il est diplômé du Carleton College et ancien élève de la Haley School. Il a été boursier de l'Université de New York, de la Manhattan School of Music, de la New York Public Library for the Performing Arts et était aussi boursier de l'Université de Harvard, de l'Université de Drexel. Et il est actuellement chercheur invité à l'INHA pour tout le mois d'avril jusqu'à début mai. Il a également, en tant que critique, rédacteur en chef du magazine Flat, contribué à Dance Europe Magazine, Dance Business Weekly, Huffington Post, et il est actuellement membre du conseil consultatif de Dance Magazine. Il a fait partie pendant plusieurs années du jury de danse du National Endowment for the Arts et du jury Jadine Wong Award, présenté par l'Asian American Arts Alliance. Son dernier projet chorégraphique, du moins, il y a déjà quelque temps, le ballet des porcelaines, a été créé au Metropolitan Museum of Art et il y a en décembre 2021 et une très belle tournée en Europe en 2022. Quelques mots sur Final Bow for Yellowface, qui a été fondé par Georgina Pasco-Green, et donc soliste au New York City Ballet, et Phil Chan, avec cet engagement simple que je citerai. J'aime le ballet en tant que forme artistique. Je reconnais que pour atteindre une diversité parmi nos artistes, nos publics, nos donateurs, nos étudiants, nos bénévoles et notre personnel, je m'engage à éliminer les stéréotypes désuets et offensants des Asiatiques, Yellowface, sur nos scènes. Et depuis 2017, presque toutes les grandes compagnies de ballet américaines ont signé cet engagement. Et Gina et Phil ont conseillé de nombreuses compagnies sur les manières de préserver des œuvres phares du répertoire occidental classique, tout en mettant en évidence les représentations désuètes des Asiatiques. C'est en partie ce dont il sera question ce soir. Et je voulais juste terminer cette introduction en disant, puisqu'il va être question aussi de reconstitution, avant de leur laisser la parole, cette séance résonne particulièrement aussi après le décès de Pierre Lacotte, danseur et chorégraphe, à qui l'on doit nombre de reconstructions et une manière aussi de penser une certaine archéologie de la danse, autre question qui sera certainement présente ce soir. Je vous laisse la parole. Thank you very much for being here tonight. And this is
Thank you. Hello everyone, can you hear me? Hello? Hello, hello, testing. Great. Hi, everybody. First of all, apologies for Doug and I's presentation in English. We are barbaric Americans, so apologies in advance. Thank you so much. It's such an honor, and thank you, Pauline and Lou, for having us. And I'm so glad to be here with my very good friend and colleague, Doug. Okay, so, uh-oh, and it's gone. Just in time. Oh no. Sorry, guys. Oh, there we go. Okay, we're here to talk about La Bayadère. I assume that if you're here, you're probably a dance nerd, so you probably know all about Bayadère, or at least some idea of Bayadère, so we can skip to the meaty parts. But just to give you a little bit of an overview of the ballet itself, it premiered in... Oh, it's gone again. No. Okay, let's do this. Okay, so Bayadère premiered in 1877. Like a lot of Petipa's ballets, he was a sort of a man of the hour at all times, so he was inspired by popular events that were happening. The Prince of Wales had just returned from India on a very highly publicized tour, so that was all in the newspapers, leading up to the crowning of Queen Victoria as the Empress of India. So in terms of general society, thinking about India was a very popular theme, and so this was a great way to get people to come to the ballet, something very topical. Bayadère is probably one of the pinnacles of classicism. It's one of his most performed, celebrated, well-notated pieces, which is why we still have it today. And it features a big narrative structure, a lot of dancers, big spectacles. It's really just a big, sort of a larger-than-life magical production, which is why I think it's still popular to this day. It's something that you can't get on Netflix or HBO. You know, it's this just really, really big. It has 4 acts, 7 scenes. There's a lot of mime. There's a lot of classical dancing. So both individual dancers, you know, really understanding the classical structure, but also how large groups of people were moved, you know, choreographically as well. So I think that's why, to this day, it remains one of the most beloved works in our classical repertory canon. The basic story, it's sort of set in a fantasy India. There's this romantic love triangle between Solar, who's the bravest warrior in the community, Nikia, who's the Bayadère, she's the temple dancer, so she's allowed to move in different spaces. She's an Oriental woman, so she's highly sexual and obtainable compared to her European counterparts, other European female characters. So that made the Bayadère an increasingly interesting character on the ballet stage in the 18th and 19th century. There's the Brahmin, who's the sort of high priest who's in charge of all of the religious stuff. The Raja, who's the sort of the king of the area, and then his daughter, Gamzadi. So there's Gamzadi has been promised to Solar. They are sort of a pairing on the same social level. And then Nikia, the Bayadère, is Solar and Nikia are actually, they're the real love match. And so it's a story about class differences, but also, you know, true love, you know, against all obstacles. There were a few earlier precedences to this ballet. There was the God and the Bayadère, which from 1830, which was about a temple dancer who falls in love with a god who's she saves the god from being killed in mortal form, and then as a result, she's rewarded in the afterlife and reunited. So this, again, and here's an image of Taglioni as this sort of Bayadère, and we see that it's still, she still retains this very romantic style tutu. It's still a very Western silhouette, but with just a few Eastern embellishments, the flowers, the sort of sari motif. And this was a few years before Taglioni's success in La Sylphide. So actually, when we think about the dawn of the Romantic period and the cult of the ballerina, we often think of Sylphide, but actually this earlier Bayadère was really instrumental in getting people to see the ballerina as this dramatic role, this ethereal role, and really standing on her own as a character. Of course, there's Sakuntala, which was Lucien Petipa's, her Marius's brother, created this piece, and it's based on a 4th century epic Indian poem. And then, of course, Giselle, which also Doug is an expert about. If you have any questions about Giselle, he knows everything about it. But again, this love triangle, you know, theme that a lot of ballet audiences at the time would have been familiar with. So a familiar story, an exotic Indian theme, and, you know, a contemporary audience at that time would have also maybe read accounts of other Indian stories, reading the newspaper. So this is not. This is definitely something that would have been reflected in the period as a work of art that was very much spoke to that moment. The issue then comes when we have this ballet that has come down to us from the 1870s. It was made for a European audience, and now we live in a global society. And so those two things are not often congruent. And this was really illustrated in in very graphic detail when the Pennsylvania Ballet in March of 2020, they did a production of Bayadère. They actually did 1 or 2 performances, I think, before they were shut down by COVID. But there was a real tension in the community. Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and the surrounding regions is the home to one of the largest growing South Asian populations in the United States. So a lot of Indian people actually live in the community. And then we have this ballet company that's doing a ballet that's pretending to be about Indian people, but has really nothing to do with actual Indian culture. But it's, so the tension was, here's the company trying to present this piece that is heritage, that is tradition, that's coming up against the lived experiences of actual Indian people who have a real experience with real Indian culture. So this is really the tension of when this fantasy ballet meets reality, right? And so those two things clashed in a very spectacular manner. There were protests. There was a MoveOn.org petition from local Asian advocates saying, hey, Pennsylvania Ballet, don't perform this ballet anymore. And we also see around the world, Hindu leaders are speaking up and saying, hey, please don't do this ballet anymore. It's really disrespectful to our culture for many reasons. The sort of depictions of Indian people crawling around the floor, the sort of loose depictions of Hinduism, Buddhism, sort of casual, whatever about your religion, it's doesn't matter. And also the use of blackface as well, and darkening of the skin for the dancers, which we'll also talk about as well. Of course, the Paris Opera no longer does that. A lot of American companies no longer do blackface, but this still persists in Russia and many parts of Eastern Europe as well. So just to give you a little bit of background about my personal work and final bow for Yellowface, this work for me started in 2017 when the artistic director of New York City Ballet, Peter Martins, called me into his office. He was having some challenges with George Balanchine's Nutcracker. On one hand, this is the ballet that is most performed by the company. They perform it for 6 weeks. It makes up a huge amount of the company's revenue. The money from the Nutcracker allows the company to then program more daring works as well, so it's a really important part of our financial and cultural ecosystem. Yet Peter had received over the years, literally he said thousands of letters from people saying, hey, I'm not comfortable with the second act in the Nutcracker when the protagonist Marie goes to the Kingdom of the Sweets and she meets all of these sort of caricatured stereotypes of different countries. And people were saying, I'm not comfortable bringing my children to this show anymore. And when you're losing children for the Nutcracker, you're in trouble, right? So he was sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. He wasn't quite sure how to make changes to it, and he didn't want to just cancel the Nutcracker because it's a really important part of the company's ability to sustain itself. So he wanted to speak with someone who both knew the ballet inside and out, but also had lived experience of being a Chinese person living in the minority in the audience that he was presenting it to. So he called me, my very good friend, Georgina Pazgogan. She's a soloist with the New York City Ballet. She was in a diversity committee meeting and gave Peter my phone number. And this was, I guess, 6 years ago. And in that meeting, we talked about the history of how Asian people have been represented in the West. So looking at ballet, opera, theater, but also Broadway, film, television, radio. So where do these ideas come from? We also looked at the history of ballet itself as an art form. What cultures were involved in this development? So French culture, Spanish culture, Russian culture, all of these dances were built into ballet, not so much Arabian or Chinese dances. And based on that conversation, Peter decided to make some subtle changes to the makeup, the choreography, and the costuming. And I left that meeting and I called Gina and I said, I think Peter Martins is going to change the Nutcracker. And we realized we were at this crossroads where we saw so many other companies in America saying, yes, diversity, equity, inclusion, we want non-white people to come into this art form and feel included and feel seen, yet we were still presenting these outdated racial caricatures of the cultures from the very people we wanted to attract to be a part of our audience. And so those two things didn't really work together. So we bought yellowface.org for, I think, $11 at the time, and we put up this pledge, which Pauline mentioned, and basically now, 6 years out, pretty much every major American ballet company has signed this pledge. A lot of European companies are starting to come on board with this conversation as well. And just to give you a little bit of an idea of the difference between Yellowface and Orientalism. So Yellowface is the sort of a caricature of Asian people. It can be makeup, often painted with yellow, but it can also include physical gestures, manifestations of accents, other things like that can all fall under this umbrella of Yellowface. Orientalism is a much bigger issue. It's really this idea that Asia is a fantasy place and that we can put our own ideas into this exotic alien culture. So a lot of my work is unpacking some of these stereotypes and why it is that this is so appealing. If you're interested in my second book, Banishing Orientalism, basically my thesis is that Orientalism has served as one of the greatest drivers of creativity and innovation in the Western performing arts. Because when you don't know what those people over there look like, well, it's not like us, so it has to be opposite day. So if we point our feet, maybe you Orientals flex your feet. We do the polka and the jig and the waltz. Well, you guys, I don't know, 5/4. Let's add another beat in there, And because of that, you're starting to break the rules. You can do things like have sex and do drugs and all these things that are socially taboo in our society here in Europe, but over there, it's okay. And it's not us, we're not being sexy. We're just pretending to be Arabian people or Chinese people. So it was also a way to address social taboos in a way that was safe and could get past the censors. So a lot of my work too is questioning this Eurocentric nature of ballet and thinking about how do we make this art form, which started off in the courts of Italy and France and Russia, and make it for everybody, right? I mean, including most of the people in this room probably should not be allowed to do ballet because none of us are royal, and there's a few women in the room also, so if you're a woman, you probably also would not have been allowed to do this form. So the fact that we've already changed so much since even the courts of Louis XIV just shows you that this art form is continuing to develop and change, and if so, why can't we include better representations of non-Europeans, especially if we want them in our audiences and buying tickets and supporting this art form. So just how do we think about Eurocentric versus multiracial or a global way of thinking? So everyone just cover one eye for a moment. And when you cover one eye, like you're looking through a telescope, suddenly you lose depth perception, right? It's harder to see how close something is. You also, if you look towards your nose, you can only see about 140 degrees. So it's a very limited amount of information you can perceive. Now, if you open both eyes, so now looking at it through like binoculars, our eyes are set slightly far apart to give us these benefits, right? We can see 180 degrees, we see distance, we see a lot more clarity. So that's really the challenge that artists today have to do when we're thinking about how do we make this work multiracial. It means we need to see the same thing with multiple perspectives at the same time. And if you have two eyes, you already know how to do that, right? So now it's how do we do that from a philosophical or an intellectual level as well. Also, the shift from Eurocentric to multiracial. If we see here, this is the old way of presenting art with Europe in the center, and then sort of all of these other countries dancing around them, like the Rose Adagio from Sleeping Beauty, right? Here's this princess, European princess, and then all these other men of the world come around and they're the exotic people to dance with her. Whereas in a multiracial way of thinking, you see that those lines are a little bit blurred. They're mixed. I'm biracial. I'm Chinese and German, so I'm also living proof of this multiracial blend. And if you notice, multiracial doesn't mean canceling Europe or canceling white people or canceling contributions from Europe. You get more. We're not getting rid of Shakespeare and Mozart and Balanchine. We keep all of that, but we get more. It's a plus. It's an addition, not a subtraction. So just when you reframe that way of thinking, it doesn't feel like cancel culture. It actually is an opening experience to really allow more creative solutions to come across. So I'm going to shift gears and turn it over to Doug, who's going to talk a little bit about the history of the Bayadère itself. Yes.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having us here. Let's talk about a few of the ways now, returning to La Bayadère, how Hindu Indians were depicted in the ballet as it was put together. And we can start right off with the concept of the Bayadère. What is a Bayadère? Well, there is not actually a Bayadère in Hindu society. The French term Bayadère is taken from the Portuguese term for female dancer. So all of that terminology is Western European terminology that was used by poets, by librettists, and by choreographers as they were appropriating what in India was the Devadasi, which was a Hindu religious woman, a servant of the temple, essentially married to the deity, and had a lot of agency, ranked higher than most men, had a number of legal rights, sexual freedoms. So quite an independent woman compared to the social place of women in Western Europe in the 19th century. Am I missing anything there? No. So in taking the Devadasi and then creating the Bayadère, agency was removed, and the Bayadère was depicted as a woman who was still a temple dancer, but was subservient to men, was in a way, not to appropriate a Christian term, but a sinner, an individual in need of some kind of redemption or saving, probably by a man. So this Devadasi was downgraded to become the Bayadère. So I think it's essential to understand that transition of taking that elevated female religious and changing that for use in Western art.
I think that probably also had to do with when we colonized India, a lot of the Bayadères, the Devadasis, lost their royal patrons and they lost their religious affiliations, so they often had to turn to sex work in order to survive. And so there became this association between the Devadasi and sex work and prostitution that kind of pushed her rank down, even though that wasn't her natural place. So it was actually the introduction of European ideas that sort of pushed the Devadasi into this sort of lower rank as well.
Yeah. Thank you. We see this in Goethe's God and the Bayadère, late 18th century, and of course in the ballets that Phil has already talked about, in the Bayadère libretto, which was put together by Sergei Kudakov and Marius Petipa. We see a sort of merger of the two terms where Devadasis are defined as Bayadères of the first rank. So a little bit of conflating of two terms there. Some of you may have known Jean-Andrea Poesio, the dance historian who wrote about Bayadère and has a great quote saying, "The double nature of priestess and dancer epitomize the characteristic dichotomy of the romantic female image," referring to the Bayadère. Both a saint and a sinner, an angel and a whore, unreachable and desirable. So we have these two elements in the Bayadère, and in the particular ballet, we have those in Nikia. Then let's talk about how people of color were depicted in Bayadère. Now every character in this ballet is intended to be a Hindu Indian. Some of the characters had skin darkened and to varying degrees, and some did not. In looking at the imagery that we have, photographic imagery and sketches, we can see that there was both, in choosing which people and characters had their skin darkened, we can see that reflected in the hierarchy of the Imperial Ballet Company and school, and also in the social hierarchy of the characters in the story. So lowest ranked dancers, which would have been the young boys from the school, Petipa often used 12 boys in his exotic ballets, and they generally had their skin really darkened. Male supernumeraries had their skin darkened. The most exotic characters in character divertissements, characters that didn't have particular names, but they would be characters, for example, in the Hindu dance in Bayadère, the character with the drum had their skin darkened.
The fakirs.
Right, the fakirs, the Hindu religious men, whose choreography was so non-balletic that it was not notated, while other ensemble choreography was, and we'll get to that. But in contrast to this, the higher ranking dancers, the ballerina, the leading male, those characters that have governmental or high religious authority, like the Raja and the Brahmin, they did not have their skin darkened. So again, while every character is a Hindu Indian, only certain characters, and generally the lowest ranking socially or in the ballet hierarchy, had their skin darkened. And also, this is reflected in step vocabulary. Those with darkened skin, certainly because they were the lower ranked in the ballet hierarchy, were given the simplest steps too, and the most non-balletic steps. Whereas those wearing point shoes, those doing strict classical step vocabulary would not have their skin darkened. So we can see how some of those choices were made. Let's look at a couple images. So here on the left, we have Madhavaya, the fakir. You can see ragged clothes, disheveled hair, carrying a dagger, skin is darkened. Two of the young boys sitting on either side of Solor here, you can see they would wear skin darkening clothing and then would have their faces very dark. And then the caricature by the Legat brothers of the drummer in the Hindu dance. We see these are such great caricatures, even though they're animated, just to show us how the costuming was achieved. With the dark clothing, the dark shoes, the wig, large lips, the big earrings, just as exotic as they could make this character. As opposed to here the Raja and his daughter Gamzadi and Pavel Gert as Solor, who read Western European or European in their appearance, despite everyone being Indian Hindu. So that's a look at a way that the decisions were made in determining which characters, which people would have their skin darkened. We can look at the score too by Minkus. Now Minkus was not a celebrated composer, but he was a very skilled theatrical composer. He knew how to deliver the type of music in the style that Petipa wanted and in the sort of 16-bar periods that Petipa liked, so it was very consistent, but he also knew the rules of exoticism as well. We'll take a look in a moment at some motifs that he used to give some continuity to the score. We'll find that the motif for Solor is a very harmonically European-sounding piece of music, whereas where Nikia is being depicted, she has the more exotic winding melodies with a chromaticism that were some of the musical tropes that were used to depict others or exoticness. So we can have a look at those. These are just simple piano versions. So here's Solor's motif in Act 1. Let's just give a listen. Forward, a little bit martial, but completely common practice. Nothing that sets it in any particular place. Okay, just for contrast, Solor gets another theme when we get to the third act, because now his story has changed and he's conflicted and anxious. So we have a darker theme for him in the third act. lyric, which is, these stories were all melodramatic tropes. Now, we get to the dance for music to accompany Nakia in the opening scene, and here the thought is that Minkus was trying to depict bagpipe, which was called the turti, which is made of goat skin, and bagpipes were often depicted with sort of drone sounds, and they could be for any kind of country music or folk music or any kind of music that used a bagpipe, and also then the Indian veena, which was a stringed instrument but was often depicted using the flute, because the flute could play quick, rapid, chromatic, kind of winding, a little bit directionless melodies that were used to depict exotic characters. So here's Minkus's imitation of the turti and the veena. Sort of, if we played more, it really sort of snakes around and does all the kind of things you would expect, and uses the sort of melodic phrasing that composers would use when they were writing in exotic, or what they considered an exotic idiom. So we can see in how the story was conceived, how the story was dressed, how it looked visually, and also how it sounded. All of these tropes for exoticism were present here in Bayadère.
Did you say snaking around on purpose? Was that a pun? Is that a joke for us?
No, but it did cross my mind. So now we can, well, Phil and I feel strongly, and I think this is true for any ballet, if you're going to look at a ballet, especially one that has been handed down over time and changed so much, it's invaluable to look at what it was like when it was first created as best as we can. The source situation for Bayadère is pretty good. There are a lot more sources available in the Mariinsky archives that just aren't available. Their archives has traditionally been closed. It's very closed now. But there are a number of documents that we can look at. Petipa took good notes. He made a lot of notes to himself. He communicated in writing to his collaborators, and we have a lot of this material. He made good preparatory notes for Bayadère. He would write out the pantomime conversations. He would write reminders to himself. I need to decide this, I need to decide that, or I talked to so-and-so at the opera tonight and gave them this list, and then he would make the list. So we can see in Bayadère how he was putting the story together. His instructions to Minkus, we don't have the actual instructions that he wrote down for Minkus. They may be somewhere. They've not been located, in the same way that we have Petipa's instructions to Tchaikovsky for Sleeping Beauty and for Nutcracker. But in his notes, he has written, I gave this to Mr. Minkus yesterday, and then he lists some of the material where he says how many bars he wants and what's going to happen in the action and how all those things should be achieved musically. We have the libretto, of course, which Petipa worked on with his colleague Sergei Kudakov. The libretto is great for having an overview of the story. It's always really good to know that the libretto represents usually the beginning of the story or just what was told to the public. The actual working out of what happened on stage happened in the studio. So the mime conversations that you might see in the libretto may not be the same that were actually performed on stage. They would usually be much richer and more complex than that. A repetiteur. The ballet was rehearsed in Russia. It was common to rehearse with 2 violins, so the score would be arranged, usually by the composer, for 2 violins that were played in the studio. And these were referred to as repetiteurs, and they were often annotated with entrances, exits, mime conversations, sometimes with steps, and sometimes there would be multiple versions of these that different collaborators would have. Sometimes the ballerina would have her own. So we have one of these. The microfilm of it is at Harvard. Covent Garden also has a copy of an Imperial era piano reduction at the point when they started using pianos in rehearsal. And this is another helpful source for the music. It sort of allows you to move past a lot of changes that were subsequently made to the ballet and get to the music and the other source material before those changes were made. We have a wonderful choreographic notation that was made of the ballet that represents the revival in December of 1900. This was made by Nikolai Sergeyev. There's been some writing that says maybe it's by Alexander Gorsky, but it's definitely Sergeyev's handwriting. It's very carefully done. One of the best examples of Stepanov notation. It looks like Sergeyev had made a rough draft, an early copy, and this was the final copy. Sometimes he'll write, "See my rough draft," and so we can know that this is a very carefully presented copy. This is at Harvard, and it does represent the cast with a couple minor exceptions that performed in 1900. And this would have been when Petipa was still working full-time. He was in charge of this revival, so we know this represents his work.
And also a note for the dance notation nerds out there listening, this collection is being digitized right now, so it will soon be publicly available for everybody, so you don't have to go to Harvard to access this, which is very, very exciting for our field.
Yeah, that's been slow coming. Usually it would be if you wanted a ballet, you would pay for the digitization and then it would go up on the website for everybody. But now they've gotten a grant to do the whole thing, which is really nice. Stepanov notation, I'm not sure how many, I know some of you are very familiar with it. This was a system developed in the early 1890s in St. Petersburg by a dancer named Vladimir Stepanov. He studied anatomy here in Paris. He was given leave from the company to come and study here with a neurologist and developed his notation system, which he published here. It was subsequently published in Russian in St. Petersburg. He died several years after he developed the system, and then it was taken over by Alexander Gorsky. It was taught in the school in St. Petersburg. Then Gorsky was transferred to Moscow in the fall of 1899, and his assistant, Nikolai Sergeyev, took over the notating process. And that was right about the time that Bayadère was made. And it really is the last of the very carefully notated ballets. After that, the notations are more like the rough drafts, I think, that Sergeyev talked about, simply because his time was very limited. He was a rehearsal director for the company. He was teaching in the school and trying to notate the ballets. He was given 2 assistants in 1903. We don't have much of their work. The thought is that when Sergeyev left Russia and took the notations with him in 1917, that he took what he had, and that his assistants probably had their own copies of things, and we don't know what happened to those, if they have survived or if they've, are just relegated to history now. But what we do have from Sergeyev is at the Harvard Theater Collection, which represents the large majority of extant Stepanov notations. We also have, wonderfully, a mime script, which is held in the Bolshoi archives, also in Sergeyev's hand, and includes names of the dancers from that cast in 1900. This is great because the first couple scenes of Bayadère are largely exposition. They're largely action scenes, and then we really get into the dancing with the third scene. So we have these first 2 scenes really well laid out in very complicated conversations that the dancers had with each other. And when you compare that to the libretto, as we will soon, you'll see what a difference there was between the slim libretto and the very rich mime script. Almost lastly, the Mariinsky Theater had a sort of a production book where for each ballet they would have a diagram of what the stage setting was and a list of the props used for that scene. It was essentially a stage manager's guide, and from this we can see how the scene was laid out. You can see the different wings, 1 through 4 there, an overhead view, and above that the front view, and then down below that a list of the props. Sometimes it'll say which opera they borrowed the props from. We get a really practical idea of what was happening on stage. Finally, programs are a great source for cast numbers and knowing who danced when and trying to trace that. Students aren't usually named, at least younger students, but just about everybody else is. For example, we know that there were 48 shades from the very beginning in 1877. Sometimes you read Petipa expanded to this number, but it was always 48 in 77, 84, 1900. So we can learn things like that from these programs. Then, how do we take these all together and learn about the ballet? Can we make a scene-by-scene description of what happened on stage here? What was said in pantomime? What steps were danced to the music? So that's something that I've tried to do in the book I've written with Marion Smith. And let's just take a quick look here. Here's the libretto excerpt from Act 2, Scene 1. This is where we meet Princess Gamzadi. Her father, the Raja, is telling her that she's going to marry Solor. She feels some anxiety because she's not sure that Solor will want to marry her. And we can see what the conversation is between the two. Today, my child, the day of your marriage, with the brave warrior Solor will be decided. It's time for you to marry. I agree, Father, only I have yet to see him. I'm not sure if he'll love me. And her father says, well, he has to because I'm his boss. And so we can look at the mime script and then see how was this really worked out. So here is the mime script that Sergeyev wrote. He says, Hamsadi enters with 2 ladies of the court, so we know she has 2 ladies in waiting with her. She greets her father, he embraces her, he kisses her forehead, and they walk forward. Mime conversations were often held downstage in the footlights. They would come close to the audience so they could see more clearly. Hamsadi says, why did you call me from there? Which sounds so odd to us, but in mime it was often it was common to say from there to here, and then you'd point in front of you. There's a lot of from there to here, a lot of kind of a repeated rhetoric here. Her father says, you listen to me, I will tell you. I called you from there to tell you, you remember there was one, referring to Solor, who has now grown up and you are to be wed to him. And each of these phrases would have gestures that would constitute the pantomime. And it seems as though Sergeyev wrote the words down in the order the gestures would be performed. Hamsadi says, I am to be married to whom I do not know him. Her father says, calm down. He is one of ours. He has a brave heart and you will meet him. Hamsadi says, he has not seen me. And her father says, just wait, he will see you, your figure, your face, he will fall in love for certain. And then he says to one of the priests next to him, call him from there to come here. And the priest leaves, and then the father says to Hamsadi again, just wait, you will see, he will come here. So that is how pantomime conversations were put together. And it's important in working with these documents to translate the text very literally. It's easy to want to make it a better sentence or more grammatically clear. But my advice is don't do that. Translate the words exactly. And that helps us see what the pantomime was. All right, let's look at a little bit of dancing. Here's a photograph of the Kingdom of the Shades scene from 1900. It's sort of intended to be a rocky Himalayan landscape. We have the corps de ballet of 48 dancers. The 3 soloists are kneeling on our left, and Matilda Kshestinskaya and Pavel Gert are Nikia and Solor in the center. So the next slide shows us the variation of the 3rd shade soloist, which was Anna Pavlova, an early solo role for her in 1900. The notation system, if you've not seen it, uses Western musical notation, which is wonderful because it shows you the rhythm the movement. This notation only gives movements for the legs and feet, which was common particularly for later notations, but many of the Bayadère notations also provide positions of movement for the torso and the head and the hands, arms, hands, and wrists. But it's also written out like music in the meter of 2/4, and then if we look at the corresponding music in the repetiteur, we can see the music in 2/4, and you can read the two together to know the steps and how they were performed in rhythm. And here's Anna Pavlova. This is her in 1900 in her shades costume, so we get an idea of what that looked like. And then we can build a dance description from this, which has a lot of steps that we are familiar with. So I should also say this is the shades variation that's performed very slowly today, but we have right. But the metronome mark in the music is much faster. It's like a Sousa march, like it's quite quick, and we can see that the steps fit that. The first step is a si-son doublé, so you'd land step assemblé, 1, 2, 3, and go from there. And we can see the steps are steps we're familiar with today. You often hear, I've often heard, in the 19th century the dancers just ran around and didn't really do steps. That's completely ridiculous. They did very difficult steps and they moved very quickly. We know that. And so from this variety of source materials, we can work out what the steps were and give a description of it. And of course we can teach it to someone and have them dance that particular variation at the speed we think they danced it and in the way we think it was done.
And it was probably slowed down by the Soviets, it's just as an aesthetic.
Yeah, aesthetics changed, emphasis on sort of strength and slow développé. These weren't aesthetics of the time. Speed was the major aesthetic of the time period. Very quick muscular reflex and speed. You see it more now in musical theater dancers, Broadway dancers, than you do in ballet dancers today because we're very elongated and stretched out now. So our movement quality is different.
So from there, the challenge before Doug and I, and actually we've been talking about this for 5 years, Doug and I, so by the time it premieres, we've been working on this for 6 years by the time it premiered. But we had the challenge. We have this incredible amount of information about what it was. Obviously, we can't do it the way it was at the time, even if we wanted to. That's sort of a false idea that's just not physically possible. But the question is, what do we do with this text to reinterpret it, to keep it alive for today? So looking at the problems of the ballet, the depictions of through costuming, the physical caricatures of the different religious issues, and so how do we fix that, right? How do we keep the steps, but make it so that it's multiracial, global, as opposed to just being Europe's view of this exotic India? Because in the 21st century, that's no longer the value. We have Indian friends, neighbors, family members, probably. And so we're living in a very different time and we have a very different relationship. So how do we find a congruent setting that works for these steps, that keeps the intention of what Petipa wanted, and also gives the impact, a similar impact on audiences today, which wouldn't have been, ooh, this makes me really uncomfortable because my sister-in-law is Indian and I'm really uncomfortable watching this. That wasn't what Petipa wanted. He wanted you to say, oh, that's a brilliant dance, or oh, that's beautiful. So how do we keep that spirit alive while being true to what he wanted? And so the challenge for us was finding congruency. And a big part of my process in doing this is, it's a game I like to call, what else could it be? So for example, let me borrow your pencil. So this is a pencil, right? And when you're a little kid, this pencil is not just a pencil, it's a rocket ship, right? It's a magic wand, it's a lightsaber, right? This is not just a pencil. It could be many different things. And so as a creative person, we have to be able to keep our minds open, to be playful, almost childlike in this reimagining. So what else could this be? So we have this notation. What else could it be? And so first of all, seeing what it was, how do we find a scenario that has a congruent narrative? So the story is really important, right? So that love triangle, the dynamics of the different political and class hierarchy, that was a really important part of the story. Also the character choreography. How do we find a setting that works for the dances that Petipa created that would also look like something else? How do we create this ballet with a similar cast size and show all of the formations and all of the steps? And what kind of a setting would show that? What are excuses for dances that would make sense to a contemporary audience? So things like weddings traditionally have been a really good excuse. Festivals, right? In ballets, there's always these big celebrations as excuses for dance. So what's an excuse for us today for a big dance? Also, what's a setting that allows high energy dancing? It couldn't take place in a dark cave in the middle of nowhere, right? Because there's no high energy dancing there. So what's a setting that we could have that? And then also the musical style, listening to the music. What else does it evoke beyond just this exotic perfume of India? And so Doug and I were chewing on this and what's the best way to tell this story? And I think we're both fans of, you guys have seen Singin' in the Rain, Debbie Reynolds, Gene Kelly, right? So imagine a Bayadère where Nikia is Gene Kelly, or is Debbie Reynolds, Solar is Gene Kelly, and Lena Lamont, I can't stand him, right? That's Princess Gamzadi, right? So we have the same hierarchy of class, of power, the same love triangle, but we're starting to say, okay, well, what about this period in the 20s to the 50s that we could be inspired by in this sort of golden age of the Hollywood movie musical? A big part of this process too was thinking, how do we make the story not about them, capital T, them over there, but make it about us? How do we make the story about us? And so finding a period that was, that felt like it had integrity for who we are today. So we settled on this period, and Doug and I are both fans of this old style, but this is our show poster for this new Bayadère, and there's our Nikia, there, and she's a cowgirl, right? She's doing a Hollywood movie musical that's set in this sort of Wild West fantasy cowboy place. And again, the cowboy is a big fantasy in American culture. Everyone was a cowboy. There were black cowboys, Chinese cowboys, Jewish cowboys. Everybody was a cowboy. And it's also one of those fantasies in America that has become really big. It's not, it really is like a fantasy. On top of it, there being real ranchers, there's this cowboy culture that is this American fantasy. So we thought that, okay, how can we make the fantasy about us? Cowboys felt really appropriate. But again, there's many other ways you could do this. This is just one way of finding a congruent setting. So another possibility is, well, since the ballet is Russian, you could also make the story about Tsar Nicholas II, who had to choose between his wife, the empress that he was supposed to marry on his same class, but he had a mistress. This is historically true. His mistress was the prima ballerina of the Mariinsky Theater, literally the temple dancer, right? And so you could tell this same Bayadère story with many other scenarios that are congruent. So our way with the cowboys is just one way to do it that works for us. But the challenge, I think, is for ballet companies around the world to find a congruent setting that works for you and your community, for your audience. So this might not work in Paris, but it's going to work in America. So this idea of congruency, first of all, looking at the narrative itself, the melodramatic story was very similar to the melodramatic stories in a lot of these Hollywood movie musicals. And here we see some of the parallels. There's the two rivals there, and we see this over and over again. It's a very familiar trope in our history. So that was one way of finding congruency, right? We have this same dynamic elsewhere. So it wouldn't be a strange thing for audiences. It would not be unfamiliar for an audience to see this love triangle versus this love triangle. It's the same. Looking at the character choreography, and here Doug pulled these lovely slides where we see the sort of front attitude step. A lot of these dances were supposed to be entertaining, and these music hall dances that came after Petipa were obviously inspired by that. If you look at Busby Berkeley, for example, as a director, you'll see many of the patterns, even looking above, all the things he was able to do as film. It's literally the same structure that Petipa used as well. So again, finding that congruency as well.
I've always thought, I know it sounds so strange, but I've always thought that the character choreography in Bayadère looks very much like music hall dances. The reason is that there was no, Petipa wasn't trying to create Indian dance. The dance wasn't intended to look like Indian dance. It was high energy character dancing, and he had a certain vocabulary of steps. Alexander Sharayev wrote about it really well. He was one of Petipa's ballet masters, about this vocabulary of steps that Petipa used, and it was very transferable, and Petipa used it in all kinds of situations. Petipa revived Giselle again in 1899, just before this, and there are many, many similar step combinations in the notation of Giselle, which is set in Germany and also was a ballet that came from 1841, and Bayadère, which he revived the next year in 1900. And that's not to demean Petipa. He was an excellent choreographer, a man of the theater. He had a lot of tools at hand, and he utilized them in many different situations. But again, I've always thought, stripped of the costuming, I thought these steps would be right at home in the 1920s on a music hall stage, say in London, or in America for that matter, or anywhere else where this ensemble, fast ensemble dancing was performed.
We also see the parallels with the cast size and the geometric formation. So again, this is a section called The Shadow Waltz from The Gold Diggers of 1933, a Busby Berkeley film. And again, we see the same ramp. We see this parade of women in white. It's the same. It's congruent. It fits. And so our vision of Kingdom of the Shades is an Art Deco Busby Berkeley fantasy. Right? And it works with the Petipa choreography. It conveys both the intention of the choreographer, but also matches the impact on what an audience would have seen, which would have been this vibrant, lively, really impressive way of seeing all these bodies moving together in a beautiful, sublime way. So again, bringing that forward into the 21st century while looking to the past at the same time. And then also, like Doug mentioned, this high energy dancing, right? So they're supposed to be Hindus, but there's all of these other ways that energy can be replicated. So again, I love these photos. They're similar. This is Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland here. But there's a lot of precedent in this as well, even within the ballet canon. So looking at dances from like Agnes de Mille's Rodeo, Oklahoma, Western Symphony, it very much encapsulates the spirit that we're looking for that would have been in Bayadère if you took away the turban. It's that same energy. So again, finding that congruence. And then finally, the musical style. Bayadère is made up of waltzes and polkas and marches. And all of those are also from this 1920s, 1930s period in musicals. It just fits really, really well as a way to translate some of these old rhythms and make them sound familiar even to audiences today, but especially to evoke that specific period that we're going after.
One of the things that we've decided to do is to reorchestrate the Minkus score. Not a decision we made lightly. I'm a real purist when it comes to music. One factor here is that we don't have access to Minkus's score, but because we are putting the ballet in such a new and very specific context, we felt the music really needed to reflect that sound-wise. So what we've done is asked a specialist in the music of vintage musicals, his name is Larry Moore, to orchestrate the Minkus score in a similar way that another arranger, Robert Russell Bennett, worked with the scores of Gershwin and Cole Porter and Jerome Kern, the Rodgers and Hammerstein team, Lerner and Lowe. Just like Robert Russell Bennett, Larry is taking Minkus' score right from the repetiteur and the piano score and setting it to orchestra, just like Robert Russell Bennett would have. So the orchestra, it's a symphony orchestra, but it also has the jazz elements of saxophone, keyboards, a drum set, and a broader range of percussion. So it really has the sound of a theater orchestra from the 30s.
And also a few other American instruments. So we have a banjo, I think a fiddle, a vibraphone, triangle, so some other instruments to give it a little bit more of a period sound as well.
Yeah, to give it the flavor. So we've got a couple examples here. These are computer generated because it hasn't been played live yet, but it will give you an idea of what the sound will be like.
And just so you know the notation process, Doug is very humble and won't tell you this himself, but basically Larry is very old school, so he hand wrote all of the reorchestration, and then Doug has to program each note into this Sibelius program. So like hours and hours and hours of his life spent plugging this in.
You get to know it really
Brilliant,
well.
brilliant. So this is the product of Doug's very, very hard work here that we're listening to. Do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, so this is the opening of the ballet. If you're familiar, we open up on the sort of grotto with the temple scene. Solor and the warriors are hunting, and we have that sort of anticipatory music. And then we get Solor's theme, which we listened to earlier. So this is very much an introductory scene.
And of no fault of Doug's own, it's like an electronic file, so please excuse it if it doesn't sound like a real orchestra. It's just to give you a flavor of what it will sound like. right. Sorry, that's a little loud.
Worried the next one's going to be.
Yeah. Do you want me to? Let's see if I can turn that down a little bit.
Yeah, it was that, just a bit. No, okay. More palatable.
Yeah. Sorry, guys.
Okay, so that's on the whole, quite straightforward. I mean, there's some counter melodies added, and of course, it's reorchestrated. When we get to the more exotic music, we gave ourselves a little bit more latitude. So the piece that I had played, which is in 2/4, we decided we could put a tango rhythm underneath that and create a tango out of it, which was a very popular dance at the time, of course. So this is what that's going to sound like.
And this is the variation for Nikia in Act 1,
Yes.
which in our production is switched, and it's going to be a variation for Gamzati and the core men, again, following the sort of musical theater idea where one woman is dancing and sometimes she leans in and all the guys lean in with her, you know, and so it's still a solo, but it just will feel a little bit different.
Comes in the same place. In a couple of instances, and we can talk about this later if you want to hear, we have reassigned a couple of the dances just that it fit the narrative a little better in our determination.
So here's our Act 1 Nikia / Gamzati tango.
Right, so the question is, well, what about classical choreography? In our view, it's the most sort of transcendent aspect of the ballet because, well, as we know, ballet has endured many sort of aesthetic changes and steps that were performed 200 years ago, we still perform today. We might perform a glissade differently, and it may depend what school you're trained in, but a glissade is a glissade, and a jeté is a jeté, and a ballerina, and so forth. So the nice thing about the notation is that it shows you the step and how it was performed. It doesn't suggest mannerism or largely doesn't suggest a particular sort of movement style. But so we feel that's much sort of easier to incorporate. And ballet was used in this period, of course. Dancers on the stage were trained in ballet, and there's a lot of ballet influence in show dancing as well. So we're going to stage the classical dance as the classical dance, and not try and change it to be something different from that.
No hip-hop.
Some things that we can do that we feel like we're in a better position to do than if we were just doing straight up Bayadère today is work with some of the elements that we do find in the dance notation and from the style of the time, particularly the speed. Now we're really looking forward to recapturing the speed of the movement and dances that have slowed down significantly over a long period of time. We're going to try to perform them with the markings in the score. Sergeyev and his collaborators put in metronome markings which help us know the speed that things were performed at. It was the style of the time, so I have to backtrack a little. It was the style of time to flex the wrists in many arm positions, which is something we don't see even in much reconstruction work today, to flex the wrist and to turn it slightly inward. But we do see this in a lot of show dancing of the time. We see it really maybe through the early 60s. You can still find Jacques d'Amboise on stage in the 60s with the more flexed wrists, and we feel like we can incorporate these elements from the sources in a ballet set in this period.
It was also coded as oriental flexed hands and feet. So again, there's this nod to this orientalism, but also making it something different.
And then just a few other things, some one-armed partnering, fast preparations. Usually for a pirouette, you step to fourth and go. It's not bourrée and set and then go. It's just step, go, which we find in a lot of the Balanchine ballets. I find often a fairly straight line from Balanchine from this material to what I see in the Balanchine ballets, and also in the character steps as well. We mentioned Western Symphony. A lot of the sort of vamping steps or traveling steps that we see Petipa using a lot, Balanchine used as well, because they were the steps that he learned and he was trained on, and he kept those in his work. And they can at times be a model for us and moving a context forward like we're doing here.
So then the challenge for us is, okay, so we have this idea for a ballet. How do we make it happen? This process was interrupted by COVID. So, again, coming out of COVID, most companies barely have enough money to keep the lights on, let alone produce a new full-length ballet, right? This was not something that was of interest to a lot of companies as soon as COVID hit. Before COVID, they were like, yeah, this is exciting. How do we do this? Co-productions. And then after COVID, it's like, guys, we have to fire, half of our core. Like, we can't afford to do this now. So what do we do? Luckily, we were connected with the folks at Indiana University, and an institution, I think the Jacobs School of Music has an annual budget of $90 million a year at Indiana University. The stage at IU is the same size as the stage at the Metropolitan Opera House. It was built there because land was cheap, and so they could build the sets in Indiana as a trial for the Metropolitan Opera in New York. So the set shop we actually visited last December, the scene shop is right off stage. So they can literally build it and then just roll it out on stage, test it. If it doesn't work, they just roll it off and then they can fix it. Whereas in New York City, it would be union hours, it would be cost prohibitive to do that. So Indiana University, they have to produce a ballet for their students every year anyway. They have a budget for that. It's an opportunity for their students to learn, and we were so thankful to have this opportunity to work at IU, not just for the resources, but also for the educational component as well. The IU faculty really not only wanted their dancers to have the experience of embodying the dance, actually learning the steps and the benefit of doing the dances and not just watching them, but also to really understand this larger conversation we're having around race and representation. So it was really like a twofold reason why this was an attractive project for IU. So we're going to go back in December of this year, and then we have, I think, like a 2-month period in late January through the end of March, when it premieres in March 29th of next year. So I wanted to show you a little bit of, I know we had showed some of the mime earlier. This is literally a screenshot from our working document. So we have the timestamps on one side, we have what the original was in the mime, and then sort of our version of what it looks like. So Saul, Nikki, you know, these new characters. And it's the same congruency. So we're trying to find a similar dialogue to have in our production as the original. So we're really trying to find those mirrorings, those congruencies. And so one last thing, just to give you a case study, this is the Bronze Idol from the 1940s. Yeah, so not in the original Bayadère, but we felt like it was such an iconic dance that audiences know today and so much fun, we wanted to include it as well. So again, what else could it be? This is a challenge for you, right? So what's a Bronze Idol in Hollywood in 1920? It's an Oscar, right? Okay, so our version has a dancing Oscar. So the director of the studio, the Raja, is thinking about, I'm going to pair Pamela Zatti, Pamela, who's the star, my big movie star female, and Saul, who's my big male star, and it's gonna win me an Oscar. And then the scene melts away, and then out comes the dancing Oscar. Of course, this is a recent photo from Russia. These are two female dancers in full blackface, and they're sort of the sort of dancing Negro pages that often accompany the dancing Oscar. And so again, what else could it be? What would make sense in this scene? So in our version, we're going to have the little boys dressed as little studio executives chasing the Oscar.
Better suits.
Yeah, so they have, just imagine little boys in tuxedos as mini studio executives chasing after the golden Oscar. Everyone wants to win an Oscar, right? So again, it's turning something that is wildly offensive by today's terms and making it charming and cute, just like it was supposed to be originally, right? People at that time didn't see that and go, oh, blackface, that's really offensive. They said, oh, that's so charming and cute, right? And that's what we wanted to go back to, is find that congruency. So yeah, that's kind of our process, and we're at the end of our dance here, but happy to open the floor up to any questions you guys have about this process. But thank you so much for coming and being a part of this seminar today.
Thank you very much for showing in so many details your work process and details, and also having the music, I think, put us right into the context as well. So thank you so much for that. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions? I had one. Could you go back? You mentioned the fact that you switch sometimes the characters. Could you go back to this and how you also... So you've been quite strict about the notations and the dance, and being very close to the notation and the steps by Petipa. But at the same time, it looks quite kind of big move to switch the characters. So how would you keep this idea of congruency and maybe authenticity with like small moves like that?
The one change that I think we've only really made a change in this opening scene. The dance that's usually performed by Nikia, which isn't a notated dance, which we would take sort of from the traditional history of the ballet. We decided in that case, because we didn't have actual steps, that we would go ahead and introduce our Gamzadi character a little bit one scene earlier. So that's really it just happens to be the piece that we played, but I think that's the only time where we've moved, we've switched something. And it was just for that narrative reason of introducing that character and establishing her. And the music seemed to fit the persona of Gamzadi, we thought, a little more clearly than it did the persona of Nikia.
I will say one place where we are making a lot of changes is the mime. You know, if you're a 21st century audience member, maybe you don't know 19th century mime, you're just a person from the street, and you come to the ballet and you see, you know, and you're sitting there thinking, wait, what does that mean? Is he doing like a Heil Hitler? Like, what is he doing? I don't understand it. And you're looking around at everybody in the audience. Everybody knows what's happening. Maybe I'm stupid. Maybe ballet's not for me. Oh my God, maybe I don't know what's happening. And I'm so worried I've just missed 5 minutes of the ballet. Oh crap, now I'm so embarrassed. I don't know what's happening at all. Ballet is not for me. I should just leave during intermission. You know, and that's a shame. So Pauline, since you asked this question, I'm going to use you as my Nikia. So in the original, right, it's like you, me, I'll love you forever, right? That's what the setting is. In our version, he goes to her and he says, he proposes to her. And everybody in the audience understands that. You don't have to know this means death, this means sleep, this, you know, this is just such a humble gesture, right?
Right.
Will you marry me, right? Everybody, right? Everybody gets it. So this idea that the mime is somehow sacred or untouchable, you have to think about, you know, intention and impact. If the audience doesn't know what's happening, you've lost them. You've lost them as a storyteller. And so we're finding ways with the mime to make it more realistic. So this means death, right? But also this. Right? Which one will an audience understand today? If you go, everybody knows, oh, that means death, right? And so it makes it easier for the storytelling. So in this process, we ask ourselves, what do we lose? Because it is true, we lose something when we lose this 19th century mime, right? But what do we gain? Right? And that is the calculation that we've had to make with any change in the score that deviates. But thinking about mime more generally, mime is a language, you know, and if nobody speaks the language, then it has no meaning, right? So when we do Greek plays from antiquity, we don't perform them in classic Greek because an audience wouldn't understand it. We perform it in French or in English or a contemporary language that you can understand what they're saying. So similarly, mime is that language that we're just translating to make relevant for the 21st century. So that's one change that we are making.
In addition to that, the mime that has been handed down is a very streamlined version of what we see in the mime script. The mime script in the particular scene you did does have Solar saying that he wants Nikia to be his wife, which is a sentence or a communication we don't have. We have swearing to love, but we don't have the other. So this does fulfill that aspect of the mime script that otherwise is going unseen. We can also look at it that way. You know, we have sort of more avenues to follow, more detail to work with by working with the source material. And I think that helps us find ways to communicate the ideas in gestures that are recognizable today. We know that the actors in their time often made choices about natural gestures that they would use to communicate, especially difficult ideas in pantomime.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, and it's really a joy to follow this concerted effort to convert, to make classics really pliable, and if it is not pliable, it is not classics. In the end, we all are using Ovid stories now. Well, in different versions, right? Everything happened already with the Metamorphoses and Shakespeare. Je peux traduire en français après, comme vous voulez. Look, on the methodological level, I see here a clear change of the genre as a way to make the classics live. So you leave behind the old grand ballet and you convert it into a form or genre that is a ballet, but it's something else also, right? Mm-hmm. So an immediate question is, what did not go right with the two recent staging of Raimonda that had somewhat similar intentions? I'm talking about the Raimonda in the Het National and the Raimonda in San Francisco. I don't want you to criticize your colleagues, but to see it from the methodological level. And of course, I jotted down what would happen to the Golden Idol, this wonderful variation composed by Zubkovsky for the clear necessity, and this is just an indicator, a sign that male dance emerged in Russia, and there was a need to change the classics, and there is a variation that is it's a mosaic. In fact, it was inserted, but it lives with the classics very organically. So it's possible the classics is pliable. So what's going to happen in your version with the shades? And will the temple come down? By the way, I like the version of Matilda Kshishinskaya taking revenge and taking down the house of Romanovs, and maybe
Yes, that's one version.
and maybe even more contemporary version, how we can take the house of Putin down.
Well, perhaps with the Russian Revolution. I think I don't want to give away the ending, but we do have a solution for how the temple comes down at the end, and we also have an unexpected tying up of all the loose ends. So I think the biggest change from the original is, I guess both Doug and I were not really comfortable with how the women were portrayed. Both Nikia and Gamzadi were portrayed in the original. And so how do we find more agency and nuance for these characters? And I think the biggest surprise, without giving away too much, is in the end, Gamzadi is a nuanced character, and at the end you feel for her too, and she also has a very interesting arc. So again, I don't want to give it away, but our ending ties up the happy ending so that everybody gets, well, not everyone has a happy ending, but it ties up the narrative in a beautiful way that is supported by the choreography. And Doug actually is brilliantly recreating that fourth act of the destruction of the temple, which most contemporary Western productions don't do that. It either ends at shades or there's a sort of a shortened ending that's sort of just like a tag along at the end, which kind of tells me that the ending doesn't really matter in the Western ideas, we don't really care that much about how it ends, how the story ends, but in our production, it will be restaged. There will be that pas de trois between Solar and Gamzadi, with Nikia sort of coming in and out, but it's not going to be a ghost in the same way. But yeah, I think you'll have to tune in and watch it. Luckily, I believe it's going to be live streamed from Indiana, so you might have to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning to watch it. But it will be available, and you guys can actually watch it live when it premieres. But definitely have thought about that, and then you asked about shades as well. Yeah, for us it's no one dies in our production. So Nikia doesn't die of snakebite. There's no opium dream. There's no fantasy. No snakes. No snakes. No snakes.
Have you?
But think about it. But think about what else could it be, right? If you're a woman, and what is the situation where, what is the death in that scene? She's dancing in front of everybody, and then suddenly she dies. What could that death be in a movie setting? And then Shades for us is the ideal classical ballet, right? It's this pure dance, plotless dance moment towards the end of the ballet that really is holding up an ideal of what ballet should be, could be. right? And so it's the vision of Nikki and Saul, of their saying, this is what we could do together. This is if we were going to make a movie, this is our vision of the future. And it's this beautiful white and silver Art Deco Busby Berkeley fantasy. All of the shades come out in white, and Solar is in a black tails, just like Fred Astaire. No turban, black tails. So, it's the same thing, but instead of being at this dark, sort of gloomy, I don't know, it can be light and vibrant and still feel exciting in a different way. So it's finding a new way to look at something we think we know very well, but giving the audience and a new way to look at it.
But still really rooted in the past. I mean, when Shades was first presented, it was on a fully lit stage, and Nikia showed Solar a castle in the sky where they would live. If you've seen the Dudinskaya and Chabukiani film from the early 40s, it's very Art Deco in design. It's not particularly sober, it's quite brilliant. And the notated choreography is quite complex, from soloists down to corps de ballet from 1900. It's very demanding. Also over time, a lot of the different orientations of the body, écarté and effacé, have been taken out of the ballet, and we'll put all those back in. Effacé was a favorite orientation of the body as opposed to croisé through the whole period of dances that are notated. And a lot of facing to the upstage corner, and so we're able to put all these things back in. But it definitely won't have a sober feel, it'll have a quite brilliant feel, and the tempos will be restored, so it will have a higher energy feeling, and not an overlay of sadness to it, more brilliance. Raimonda, well, I think you mean the Raimonda English National Ballet as opposed to San Francisco.
Yes.
I helped a little bit with that. I spent a week with Tamara Rojo because she wanted to know what Raimonda was like as close as we could get to the time it was made. And the notations were made about 1903, 4, so just 5-6 years. It's really new. So we went through all the classical dances. She already had someone to work with her on character dance, so we only looked at the classical dances. And then she decided what she wanted to use from those dances, but then also created additional choreography, and I think took from traditional Raimondas as it was handed down, which, as time goes by, they stray farther from what documented choreography is. Didn't have a hand in the production beyond that. I was really a consultant for just material steps. I know at Het National they made a point of saying they did not want to consult historic sources, and I believe their source material was more based on the Konstantin Sergeyev version from, is it 48? So,
I talked to my
did you? Yeah.
Danced their traditional Russian traditional variations.
Yes.
But the plot, how did it come together? The whole idea of substituting, renewing the plot.
Yes, there was a lot of effort to renew the plot, and what do we do with the Muslim, the Muslim character who is the antagonist? That's the question. Who really gets sort of the best music and is the most, it was a mime role originally, but it's probably the most interesting character, and yet it's the character who's representing Islam, which in the 19th century it was a very good against evil was the depiction of the Crusades during that century.
The way I see Raimonda is, you guys seen Guess Who's Coming to Dinner with Sidney Poitier? Where here's a white woman and her white family, and she brings home her boyfriend, and he's black. Now what? And now we have to deal with it, right? That's also the story of Raimonda, right? It's the same. So again, finding other ways to tell that story. If the ballet is about xenophobia? Is it about what happens when we love outside of our box? Can we love outside of our box? Can we cross those? I mean, those are some of the questions that the original ballet asks. So how do we ask them today in our society? There's so many other ways to do it. So yeah, I think those are two versions of Raimonda. But again, like we're saying, those only two ways. There's millions of ways you could reimagine Raimonda. I think the question that we ask is, why? Why would you want to reimagine Raimonda for this moment unless you have something new to say? And I think that's why we chose Bayadère specifically, is because we think that we have something new to show that not only looks to the past, but also shows us something about ourselves today in this moment, which we felt like it's urgent, and as opposed to just looking at an artifact, we can make it urgent and feel alive. So.
One of the difficulties, too, is ascribing to these original ballets more intention than was actually there at the beginning. For instance, we've talked about Bayadère, you and I. It's not really about India, and Raimonda isn't really about Islam or the Middle East at all. It was about Pavel Gert being in his 50s and not doing dancing roles anymore, needing a strong character role. It was about wanting to create a Hungarian-flavored divertisement, and so we bring in King Andrei II and sort of pull him in from a different period of history. So many of these exotic elements and elements now that are distasteful to us were brought in not for those reasons, but to fulfill other purposes.
And give the ballerina like 50 variations.
Yeah, because he had Pierina Legnani, and
right.
She was a great technician and not a strong narrative actress, and so she was not given a strong narrative like you have in Giselle, or even a pretty strong narrative as you have in Bayadère. Her character is developed through her technique and the variety of the variations and codas and adagios that she's given. It's very limited otherwise. So sometimes I think these ballets are looked at and you try and make something that's not there in the first place. So Danilova had told me, just do the dances in Raimonda. Just Alexandra Danilova, she said, don't do the story, just do the dances. Just get rid of it, because it was only there to prop up the dances in the first place. So that is something to think about. Not that they should go away. We love these ballets, but what do we do with them?
It begs the question too, when we're reviving, is like, we have videos of all these dances. Do we want to spend our time and money and resources on a reimagined Raimonda, or do we want to hire a female choreographer, who are so few in our repertory? Would we rather let a woman make a new work on her own terms? So I think that's also like a moral question that we're also asking ourselves with this revival question. What are we really saving and why?
Lots of questions.
Lots of questions, yeah.
I had a question about the fakir variation. You mentioned the fact that it's not written in the score. I was curious both to know why and which sources do we have about this variation, and what did you do with the fakir, of course?
So with the notation that Sergeyev made, it appears that he primarily was trying to write down the ensemble dances because they are the most complicated to remember and to teach. Again, solo variations are much simpler, and they rely a lot on the particular individual and were often changed when a new dancer would take over a role. So we have very few solo variations notated, but we have the big group dances. You would imagine that the fakirs dance, because they're an ensemble, would be notated, but it's not. So what do we have? We have some descriptions by Akim Volinsky from the very early 20th century about movements or running through the fire, eating the fire, cutting yourself with a dagger, and the sort of more exotic actions and all. But that leads me to think it wasn't, maybe there was an improvisatory quality. It seems that there was not enough choreographic substance to warrant writing it down. Otherwise, I think Sergeyev would have written it down, because that tends to be what he did for reviving the dances.
It's the cowboys.
Right,
It's
yeah.
the like rambunctious. So in our
cowboys.
production, we also have a campfire, because that's what the cowboy version of a fire is. There's a campfire, and it's like a bunch of guys, and they're filming they're doing a cowboy dance, and they just finished filming, and they're just sort of joking with each other. Okay, who can jump higher? Oh, come on, buddy, you know. And they're sort of roughhousing. It's a little messy. It's kind of, you know, macho kind of moment with each other, kind of roughhousing, playing around. And so we can still have that feeling of this rough and tumble, but it's not Hindu monkeys. It's a bunch of bros, musical theater bros.
Yeah, so we've given a tangible context in the Bayadère opening scene. It's one of those unexplained religious ceremonies or rituals that were a part of exotic opera and ballet of the 19th century. There's no explanation for, it's just holy fire. That's as much as we get. And the Bayadères do a dance around the holy fire where they bow toward it and away from it repeatedly, but we don't know why. We don't have to know why, but the creators didn't know why either. And then the fakirs would jump over it, and it was just sort of to give that sense of mystery and otherness, something that is enticing to look at, but we don't really know what it is. And that's as far as it went. Again, it wasn't trying to recreate a particular Hindu ritual. It's simply an effect, simply to create an effect. So we created an effect within our context to give the same sort of energy and sort of flash and activity.
Thank you very much, both of you, for your contribution. I just wanted to say that I think what you're doing is, to me, what should be regularly doing and what was done in art. And because to me, the biggest problem is why should it stay as it was and not change and not evolve? Because, I mean, especially for mime, because I'm working on 18th century dance, pantomime, I mean, they never said this means this, and this gesture is like this, and this one is like this. You have a set, you have the dialogue, this was also already there, and they just did it like, the interpret did it together, the two of them, they did it like as they wanted to, as they felt like it, and maybe with very contemporary or actual connections or lattes or whatever. So I think thank you very much, because I think this should be the way of rewriting, of reconsidering classical myth, fables, stories that we should do, and the idea of this is how it should be, and this will forever be like this is maybe the worst thing for artworks, I think. Yeah.
I love hearing that. That's wonderful. When I know you have things to say, but really quick, that is one of the dangers of the Stepanov notation, is that it is like a Bible or rule book of how it should be, but we know that Sergeyev was in the studio and writing down what he saw. We know that because he included the dancers' names, and how he describes some of the pantomime. Oh, she lifts her arm and looks away, or he's just writing what he saw. It's not, this is how it should be, it's, this is what I observed at a particular moment in time. And we know it was different before that, and we know it was different after that. But it's wonderful we have the record, because it helps us understand, and we should understand and know it. But I think you're right, it doesn't have to freeze in time.
You know, there's a fencing quote that I like. It's from a French fencing master. He said, if you hold the sword, it's like a bird. If you hold it too tight, you'll kill the bird. And if you hold it too loose, the bird flies away. Right? So you need to have just that right balance of holding it close but not too close, holding it tight but not too tight, you know? So our production is still Bayadère, but it's a little bit more open. So is it the same as the original? Is it different than the original? Can it be both at the same time? It's kind of a paradox, but yes, I think it can be both at the same time. Yeah.
Thank you.
I love that. And also about the mind.
Autre question?
So neat.
Just very quickly, I was wondering with the students at Indiana University. So you showed a lot of iconographic material regarding Hollywood movies. You mentioned Busby Berkeley, and are you in the process also of showing all this material to the students? Yeah. And what's the rest you're like working on? Material from La Bayadère and other takes on La Bayadère, and material so that they could like really incorporate and embody this iconographic material.
It was so exciting. We gave a talk in December to the students, and once we started to explain it and show them some of the stuff, they were like, "Wow, this is so exciting! This is our generation. This is for us now. It's not like we're doing something old, you know, that no one will understand. This is like, oh, this is cool, you know, like." And I think that we've been invited to Indiana University specifically for that reason, is because we can give them this incredible history lesson, but also give them the tools to think for themselves about how they reinterpret the classics and show them one way to do that. And of course, we're going to show them the process. They'll be very much involved in making the piece as well, which is, I think, an incredible opportunity for any dancer, but especially for a young dancer as a student, to really be able to experiment and play and try to make it feel right in their bodies and in this time. But that's very much a part of our process with the students, for sure, which is something that you don't get in a company, sometimes in a professional company. It's just like, okay, you stand here, you do the pirouette, okay, you stand here, okay, thank you, rehearsal's over. But we're really trying to approach this in a more holistic way so that they both get the physical experience as well as the intellectual experience as well.
Which is quite fascinating because it's also about incorporating and embodying some images, which is not so far away from the process that Carlo Blasi describes in 1820 about embodying engravings, and Canova also drawings and paintings. So this idea of like using images, I think, is quite interesting in terms of the creative process for the dancers as well.
Internet is so helpful now, of course, because you have access to many images and film footage too. So we have so many of these sort of put together, and we'll have dedicated time outside the studio to also share them with the students. It's nice they have 60 ballet majors. It's like a company, and they do regular repertory, and of course, Indiana orchestras also are tremendous. It's quite a powerhouse of a school. So we're fortunate to have this sort of incubator, if you will, to create this work.
And I think the hope is this is sort of our off-Broadway trial, that then maybe a professional company would then say, oh, well, it's COVID, we don't have the money to do a full-length Bayadère, but oh, you already have a set and the costume's already built. Okay, this is a little cheaper, we can maybe do this. So, and we're already talking to a few American companies who are potentially interested in picking this up as a professional venture once we've gotten some of the kinks out with Indiana.
Thank you very much
Thank
for
you,
this
everybody.
really beautiful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Juste une petite suite, nous aurons la semaine prochaine, pour donner un petit peu la suite du programme, mardi 18, une journée d'études sur la réinvention des danses d'Asie, et plus particulièrement dans les années 1920-1930, autour de la figure de Nyota Inyoka, et donc du fonds conservé à la Bibliothèque nationale de France, mais en élargissant, et Phil aura fait le plaisir de parler de son projet d'exposition pour Jacob's Pillow à l'été prochain autour de la tournée de Rotsanni et Tetchon en Extrême-Orient. Et aussi, mais ça je l'annoncerai, Phil présentera C'est vendredi, on Friday, vendredi. Son livre Banishing Orientalism, c'est un séminaire interne à l'INHA, mais qui est exceptionnellement ouvert à l'extérieur. C'est à 10h30 vendredi dans cette même salle. Voilà, et le prochain séminaire chorégraphie, c'est le 22 mai avec Gregory Stoffer et Laurence Schmidlin, donc plutôt un artiste plasticien qui a introduit des questions de danse et de notation dans son travail plastique. Voilà, bonne soirée à toutes et à tous.
Thank you.